Great. Hello, everyone. I think what we're about to talk about follows on really nicely from what we've just heard from Lotte and Jasper, and look forward to talking to you about it afterwards. I'm going to start off with some of the context for the work that Jake's been doing with the UK Government Web Archive. And the sort of starting point for the discussion was a workshop on archives and the environment that Eirini Goudarouli, who's the third author on this paper, and I organised in May 2023. And it had three main aims. To look at the use of digital methods to explore archives as records of environmental change, to look at the impact of environmental change on archives and think about strategies for protecting and preserving those that are particularly vulnerable, and of relevance for this group, the environmental cost of creating and preserving born digital and digitised archives, and the digital infrastructure, tools and methods used to analyse them. So we convened a group of researchers and practitioners, largely UK, some from Ireland, and it now feels compulsory to mention that also some from the Netherlands. And this is a reflection on some of the themes and ideas that were generated. Some of them are designed to be deliberately provocative. You might not agree with all of them. They might not be possible within your own institutions, but they're the starting point of a conversation. One of the ideas that came up throughout was that of moving away from a commitment to best practice in archives, everything that people have been working towards for decades, and have a think about parameters of practice that might be good enough for what we need. We didn't really pin down what good enough archiving might look like, and it will vary depending on context, but not always striving for the perfect if it does have really high impact on the environment. So some of the ideas around what good enough or slow archiving and preservation might mean. Do we need, we know we don't need to keep everything, but do we even need to keep what we already have? Can some of that be removed? There was the idea of slow archiving, slower retrieval times for digital data, for example. And there was a clear role for technology and design in helping to monitor and reduce the environmental impact of archival conservation and preservation. And you've been hearing about some of that already. And particularly, and again, I think this is part of the reason why this is such a great forum to discuss these questions, there's a need for community building and knowledge sharing to amplify local action and initiatives and learn from good practice within different sectors and avoid reinventing the wheel, because we're all concerned about the environment, the impact of archives on the environment, and everybody's been thinking about it for a while now. We've already heard about minimal computing this morning. There was a strong feeling that minimal computing approaches were good. We could think about removing expectations that archival websites should be available 24 hours a day, and become much more mindful of the kind of platforms and storage we're using. But if there is a reduced or a perceived reduced service, then we really need to take users with us. You can't impose a reduced service on people and assume that they'll be happy to have lower resolution images, for example. There is a requirement for archives to develop resilience with long-term disaster planning for real rather than hypothetical risks. And one of our attendees, Georgina Robinson, noted research that 98.8% of archives in the US are likely to be affected by at least one climate risk by 2100. So these things are going to be happening soon. There was also a view that financial costs can come into conflict with environmental costs when you're talking to senior management. You could imagine an institution thinking that it's cheaper to keep duplicate material during a web crawl rather than to deduplicate because it takes more time. And there were also the difficulties of combining commercial and non-commercial services, those third parties, green or otherwise, that we were hearing about, and aligning motivations between the archival sector and the commercial sectors that we rely on for cloud computing, for example. As I said already, what would a good enough method of measuring our environmental impact look like, as well as good enough archiving? And these are some of the things that Jake is going to be talking about. So over to Jake.
So yeah, thinking through those themes from the workshop, one that really resonated me, as Jane has said, was this idea of good enough, not just in terms of our archival practice, but also what it might look like as a starting point for thinking about measuring and hopefully beginning to reduce our impact. So with that in mind, I'd like to tell you about one approach we've been experimenting with, really just to begin to get a rough picture of which of our crawls are likely to be causing the greatest impact and hopefully start informing our decision-making for the future. So we started with a couple of fairly simple questions. How has the collection been growing over time, and which of our crawls are the biggest? It's probably more complicated than that. I appreciate that there's a lot more complexity here in terms of benchmarking different crawlers, the carbon intensity of the target sites, which we've already been hearing about, and also measuring the impact of access. But in this spirit of good enough, it seemed reasonable to use the size of the archival material we're generating as a starting point for this work. So the first problem to address was acquiring this data. We experimented with using a version of our CDX index, which our supplier Mirrorweb has made available to us in AWS Athena. This lets us query the CDX at scale, and we were able to use it to generate some useful overviews, which you can see here. And encouragingly, these fit with what we already know about the history of the collection. So we can see big increases from the late 2000s, which reflect our response to changes in the government web estate. And again, from 2019 onwards, reflecting increased collecting around Brexit and COVID. And to be clear, this growth isn't a bad thing in itself, but we do want to make sure we're being efficient and responsible in managing it. However, this method of using the CDX to generate these overviews was complicated to run, has a financial cost, and we can assume a sustainability one because of the computational power required, so it's kind of not minimal computing. There's clearly interesting work to be done with this, however. For example, we could use it for identifying duplication. But in terms of looking for the kind of overviews that we're looking for, it felt kind of excessive and also unlikely that it would be readily applicable to other archives. So the approach we're currently pursuing is just to look at our inventory files instead. The inventories are CSVs, which list all of the WACs in the archive. These are updated by Mirrorweb every week, and they're an important part of how we maintain physical control of the collection. So these files already exist, and they're readily available. You can see an excerpt from one here. Clearly, we have less information here than we had in the CDX, but we have the file name in the first column and the size of the file in the second. Importantly, the file names follow a standard convention, so the crawl ID is a unique identifier for the crawl, which we can use to link with the crawl profile used to generate it, and the timestamp tells us when the file was created. So one thing to note is that by relying on this naming convention, we can only really talk about 2017 crawls and onwards, which is when we started working with Mirrorweb and the naming convention was adopted. So to process the files, we imported them into a pandas data frame, and because the inventories also include things like crawl logs, we removed any non-WAC content because we're only interested in the WAC files for this. We then extracted the crawl ID and date information from each file name. At this point, we could then recreate those plots that we made earlier from the CDX, and we could see that the trends looked the same, which was reassuring. So then we removed the pre-2017 content, and then we were able to merge the data from the inventory files with curatorial information from our internal database WAM. This enabled us to add the profile ID and the name of the crawl profile, so then we could begin looking at the impact of particular sites. So here we're looking at the size added to the collection each month from 2017 onwards. Obviously, one very striking feature is the two large peaks in January and July 2024. And being able to view the data by site profile is helpful in identifying what's going on here. So looking at the 10 biggest crawl profiles for that month, we can see that the UK Polar Data Centre is significantly larger than any of the others. So when we look at the Polar Data Centre crawls, we can see that they'd actually already been flagged up for crawl log review, aka Regex Club, which is our process for looking at crawls that have been force-stopped due to suspected crawler traps. So in a way, this is reassuring in that we've noticed this problematic crawl and taken steps to deal with it. However, it made me curious about which large crawls weren't being flagged in this way, because crawl log review only catches sites where a problematic crawl has been identified at the time it was crawled. So we could be missing lots of large crawls which are finishing naturally. So looking at the top 10 profiles in the collection as a whole, only those coloured orange have been flagged for review, meaning that the others have finished okay and haven't been looked at in crawl log review. So some of these aren't surprising. We spend a lot of time and effort capturing gov.uk, for example, and we'd expect these to be big crawls. Also, lots of COVID-related content, which is also unsurprising. However, there are some profiles in there, the Met Office and National Infrastructure Planning, for example, that we might want to review before the next crawl to see if there's anything going wrong there that we could deal with. And of course, this goes beyond the top 10, so now we can look at all of our profiles by size and maybe begin proactively examining them. But even crawls that we expect to be large, like the work we did on COVID or our regular gov.uk crawls, are worth examining. So here we're looking at the shape of our 4 largest crawl profiles minus the Polar Data Centre. And I think one interesting thing here isn't so much the big increase in the middle, which was during the height of our COVID collection and what we would kind of expect, but the fact that carrying on with our daily crawls for gov.uk has added quite a bit to the size of the collection overall. Now, we know that our users appreciate the additional coverage of gov.uk. It's like one of our core sites. But seeing them in this context gives us new impetus to our efforts to make them more efficient. For example, by exploring sitemap-based or incremental crawls like we've heard about. So what can we initially conclude from this? I guess I'd suggest that deriving this data about crawl size from our inventories is quite straightforward, and it's a good way of getting a rough and ready picture of our impact. Given that inventories of this sort are a fundamental part of managing any collection, it's also possible that other archives could adopt a similar approach if they don't already have access to this kind of data. Though it does rely on having a naming convention that supports this. So for us, the process has helped us better understand the shape of our collection and see the impact of activities such as our COVID collecting, and it's also helped us measure the impact of interventions such as Regex Club. Clearly, there's loads more to be done. I've already mentioned that this is just one way of measuring our impact, and we hope to learn more about other approaches. But thinking in terms of this process, there are a few more steps we'd like to do. First, as might be apparent, I'm not a data scientist by training, so hopefully we can get some support internally to kind of validate some of this data and code. Secondly, it's an experimental process. It's not very well optimized. It uses things like Jupyter notebooks. It would be a lot better if we could just put it in a script and then run it more automatically and more scalably. We could also add other sources of data. For example, if we added our XML crawl orders, we'd then know what crawler was used for each of these crawls, and then we could benchmark different crawler configurations. Finally, this data gives us an opportunity to expand our Regex Club process to look proactively at large crawls, and this will require moving beyond blocking crawler traps into rethinking how we efficiently capture larger sites, for example, through incremental crawling. Thank you. Over to Jane.
Jake mentioned there that this has helped him think a bit more about the shape of the collection. And just as an aside, as a researcher, seeing this work has been absolutely fascinating for me too. And it's the kind of thing that I'd love to see in a researcher dashboard, which I know there's also been some thinking about at the UK Government Web Archive. We really just wanted to conclude by emphasising that this is really the start of an experiment, the start of a conversation. And we really want to partner and collaborate with other people who are interested in this work. And we've already heard about that a lot today. We know that there are other wonderful toolkits, initiatives, networks in this space, just to name a few of them. The Digital Humanities Climate Coalition Toolkit, which includes similar resources to what we were hearing about from Lotte and Jasper. The UK Ireland Digital Humanities Association has a community interest group concerned with the digital impact, the environmental impact of digital research and scholarship. There's the Real versus Digital project, which is considering sustainability optimisation for cultural heritage preservation in national libraries. The IIPC Climate Change Collection, I think, also feeds into this conversation as an important resource for what's happening to the environment. And also the work of the Digital Preservation Coalition, members of whom are here today. Andy, yes. So we're wondering how extensible this framework that Jake is starting to develop is. And I think the only way we can test that is by being transparent and open about the processes as well as the final outputs, about what didn't work as well as what did, what are the failures and the bear traps that we can help other people avoid. And thinking about developing modular workflows that allow customization for different web archives and different contexts. Some of the processes at the UK Government Web Archive will be different from yours. Some of them, we hope, will be the same. Could we think about developing an open educational resource supporting skills and professional development that's community owned, perhaps by the IIPC, but perhaps by other organisations? What else would you like to see happening in this space to help you think about the environmental impact of your work? And I just wanted to finish with one provocation that we did get during our workshop, which was, if we're prioritising digital activity, why can't we prioritise digital preservation and have as our starting point that we want to do that, have 10,000 visitors to a website rather than have a season of Netflix? So I think there's something to be done there about advocating for, if we are going to spend money and time and effort on digital preservation and acknowledge the impact, what kinds of activity do we want to be prioritising? Thank you very much.